You wake up to the blaring sound of an air raid siren. The ground shakes as nuclear missiles are readied for launch. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, are seconds away from triggering a cataclysmic war that could annihilate the entire planet. This was the terrifying reality of the Cold War, where humanity stood on the precipice of destruction every single day. In this video, we're diving headfirst into the most nerve-wracking, high-stakes era in history. We'll uncover the secret espionage missions, the intense political standoffs, and the deadly game of nuclear brinkmanship that kept the world in a constant state of fear. From the shadows of missile bunkers to the audacious escapes over the Berlin Wall, the Cold War was a period of unparalleled tension and suspense. Stay tuned as we unravel the chilling events and key figures that shaped this electrifying period. This is more than just history. It's a story of survival, power, and the razor-thin line between peace and total annihilation. Hello, and welcome back to another amazing episode of Fact Impulse. Now, let's dive into the video. The Cold War was an ongoing political rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies that developed after World War II. This hostility between the two superpowers was first given its name by George Orwell in an article published in 1945. Orwell understood it as a nuclear stalemate between superstates. Each possessed weapons of mass destruction and was capable of annihilating the other. The Cold War began after the surrender of Nazi Germany in 1945, when the uneasy alliance between the United States and Great Britain on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other started to fall apart. The Soviet Union began to establish left-wing governments in the countries of Eastern Europe, determined to safeguard against a possible renewed threat from Germany. The Americans and the British worried that Soviet domination in Eastern Europe might be permanent. The Cold War was solidified by 1947-48, when U.S. aid had brought certain Western countries under American influence, and the Soviets had established openly communist regimes. Nevertheless, there was very little use of weapons on battlefields during the Cold War. It was waged mainly on political, economic, and propaganda fronts, and lasted until 1991. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, that started in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II, and lasted until 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union. The conflict was based on the ideological and geopolitical struggle for global influence by these two superpowers, following their roles as the allies of World War II that led to victory against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 1945. Aside from the nuclear arms race and conventional military deployment, the struggle for dominance was expressed indirectly, such as psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns, espionage, far-reaching embargoes, sports diplomacy, and technological competitions like the space race. The Cold War began with the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, started a gradual winding down with the Sino-Soviet split between the Soviets and the People's Republic of China in 1961, and ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Western Bloc was led by the United States, as well as a number of First World nations that were generally capitalist and liberal democratic, but tied to a network of often authoritarian Third World states, most of which were the European powers' former colonies. The Eastern Bloc was led by the Soviet Union and its Communist Party, which had an influence across the Second World and was also tied to a network of authoritarian states. The Soviet Union had a command economy and installed similarly communist regimes in its satellite states. United States involvement in regime change during the Cold War included support for anti-communist and right-wing dictatorships, governments, and uprisings across the world, while Soviet involvement in regime change included the funding of left-wing parties, wars of independence, revolutions, and dictatorships around the world. As nearly all the colonial states underwent decolonization and achieved independence in the period from 1945 to 1960, many became Third World battlefields in the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States were the major participants of the Cold War, but soldiers of the Soviet Union and the United States did not do battle directly during the Cold War. Instead, The two superpowers continually antagonized each other through political maneuvering, military coalitions, espionage, propaganda, arms buildups, economic aid, and proxy wars between other nations. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death in 1953. Starting off as a part of the Russian Revolution, he was a major figure in the Cold War and was instrumental in the Soviet Union's development as a superpower. Stalin's rule was characterized by a totalitarian style of government, extreme repression of dissent, and a series of 5-year plans to modernize the Soviet Union's economy. He also sought to spread communism around the world, particularly in Eastern Europe. Stalin's foreign policy during the Cold War was one of confrontation and expansion. He sought to expand the Soviet Union's influence and power, and he was willing to use military force to achieve his goals. Harry Truman. Harry S. Truman was the 33rd President of the United States and a key player in the Cold War. He is best known for establishing the policy of containment, which was a strategy to prevent the spread of communism. This policy was based on the idea that the U.S. should contain the Soviet Union and prevent it from expanding its influence. Truman also increased U.S. military spending and established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949. This was an alliance of Western countries that was intended to counter the Soviet Union's influence in Europe. Truman was also responsible for the U.S. decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. This was an attempt to end World War II and was seen as a warning to the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev. When Stalin died in 1953, many people wondered who would take his place. Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union. While Stalin often ruled through fear and intimidation, Khrushchev favored a more conciliatory approach to international relations. He wanted to improve relations with the West in order to avoid nuclear war. He called for a peaceful coexistence between the Soviet Union and the West, and even traveled to the United States in 1959 for a summit with President Eisenhower. Khrushchev was responsible for some controversial decisions, such as the decision to send Soviet troops into Hungary in 1956 to crush an anti-communist revolt, or the decision to build the Berlin Wall in 1961 to keep East Germans from fleeing to the West. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States and served during some of the most intense years of the Cold War. He is remembered for his strong stance against Soviet expansionism, as well as his commitment to strengthening U.S.-led alliances in Europe and beyond. During his presidency, he oversaw a massive military buildup that included nuclear weapons and other advanced technologies designed to counter Soviet aggression. He also sought to improve relations with Moscow through diplomatic initiatives such as the Vienna Summit in 1961, which resulted in a partial thawing of tensions between East and West. In addition, Kennedy's foreign policy focused on promoting democracy around the world by providing economic aid packages to developing nations threatened by communism. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the 40th President of the United States and one of the most influential figures of the Cold War. His administration was known for its aggressive tactics against the Soviet Union, which included a massive military buildup and a refusal to negotiate with the Soviets on arms control. Reagan's aggressive stance towards the Soviet Union was a major factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982. He was a key figure in the Cold War, as he was the leader of the Soviet Union during a period of stagnation. Brezhnev's rule was marked by a lack of economic growth, a decrease in living standards, and a lack of reform. Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev was the last General Secretary of the Soviet Union, and his role in ending the Cold War was one of the most significant of any leader during the conflict. He was the first leader of the Soviet Union to recognize the need for reform and to take steps to implement it. He introduced the policy of glasnost, or openness, which allowed for greater freedom of expression and the release of political prisoners. He also introduced the policy of perestroika, or restructuring, which allowed for economic reform and decentralization. His actions were instrumental in the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. He also worked to improve relations with other countries in the world, such as China and India. His efforts helped to bring an end to the Cold War and usher in a new era of peace and cooperation. NATO. Under the Brussels Treaty of 1948, the UK, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg concluded a collective defense agreement called the Western European Union. Recognizing that a more formidable alliance would be required to provide an adequate military counterweight to the Soviets, they joined the US, Canada, and Norway to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in April 1949. Warsaw Pact. Signed on May 14, 1955, the Warsaw Pact established the Warsaw Treaty Organization, a mutual defense alliance that was originally composed of the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. The treaty provided for a unified military command and for the maintenance of Soviet military units on the territories of the other participating states.